The day had started just like any other, the world spinning in its ordinary rhythm. The city was alive with the hum of activity cars rolling down the streets, people hurriedly moving from place to place, each caught in the rush of their daily lives. Children's laughter floated from the parks, their voices high and carefree, echoing off the buildings. The air was warm, carrying the sense of fresh bread and blooming flowers, and everything seemed to fit perfectly into the simple patterns of life. But there was something brewing beneath the surface, something unseen, something waiting. The peaceful hum of the city was about to be shattered, and no one knew it yet. It started as a strange tremor, so faint it barely registered at first. The ground seemed to sigh, like the earth itself was stretching or shifting. People paused for just a second, their feet suddenly feeling uncertain, but then the world continued on. It was just a momentary flicker, a blip in the endless motion of time. And then everything changed. The sky itself began to tear apart, like the thin fabric of reality had been ripped open by some unseen hand. It wasn't just a crack, it was a rift, jagged and violent. From it burst a blinding light, so intense and sudden that it seemed to swallow the very Sunday fiery streaks, like the slashes of a sword, cut across the heavens, igniting the atmosphere. The light was cruel and unnatural, a sickly red glow that washed over everything, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. The sun's familiar warmth was gone, replaced by an oppressive heat that clung to the skin and made the air feel thick and suffocating. People froze. The normal sounds of the city horns honking, footsteps echoing were suddenly drowned out by an unsettling silence, as if the world itself had held its breath. And then the ground beneath them began to tremble, this time with undeniable force, sending ripples through the pavement. It was as if the earth itself was buckling under an immense pressure, groaning in protest. That's when they appeared. Above them, enormous shapes began to materialize, breaking through the rift in the sky. Colossal ships, monstrous and incomprehensible, descended slowly from the darkening heavens. They were so vast, so alien, that it was impossible to comprehend their true size. They cast shadows so deep they seemed to swallow the light, turning the once bright sky into a void, a dark chasm. Their shapes were not elegant or graceful. These were not ships built for peace or diplomacy. No, these were engines of destruction, their very presence a declaration of domination. A low, rumbling roar filled the air, deep, guttural, and so powerful that it seemed to come from the very bowels of the ships themselves. It was the kind of sound that made your spine crawl, the kind that felt like it was reverberating not just through the air, but through your bones. It was a sound of sheer power, the kind that shattered everything it touched. The buildings trembled, their steel frames groaning under the strain. Glass windows shattered in a cacophony of shrill cries, raining down in sparkling shards that scattered like broken dreams. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, as though the city itself was being torn apart by the fury of a storm. But this was no natural storm, it was the arrival of something far more terrifying. As the ships hovered above, their monstrous forms blocking out the sun, the city below fell into an eerie, suffocating quiet. The air had turned heavy, thick with heat and dust, and it felt as though time itself had frozen. People stared up at the ships, their faces pale with fear, their mouths agape in disbelief. Some whispered prayers, others trembled, unable to move, their bodies frozen by the sheer terror of what was happening. This was no ordinary day. The world they knew was gone, replaced by something new, something terrifying. The invaders had arrived, and humanity unprepared, unarmed could do nothing but watch as their world was consumed by the shadows of the unknown. And then, the fire fell. It came in waves, fiery plumes of energy cascading down from the monstrous ships that hung suspended above the city. At first, it looked like a streak of bright light, cutting through the air with terrifying speed. But then, The light exploded into something far worse, an inferno, a storm of destruction that fell like wrath from the heavens. The beams were not merely fire, but pure, concentrated force, as though the very sun had been unleashed to burn away the world beneath it. The first city to feel the wrath was Soren, a metropolis that had stood for centuries, its towering buildings filled with the pulse of human life. But within moments, the streets were flooded with flames so intense, they turned the air into a living furnace. The great structures that had touched the sky now crumbled, their steel bones twisted and broken like paper caught in a storm. The foundations, once solid and unyielding, melted into nothingness as the fire washed over them, turning stone and metal to ash in the blink of an eye. The heat was unbearable. It wasn't just the flames that scorched everything in their path, but the very air itself had turned toxic, thick with the acrid scent of burning flesh and wood. It smelled like death, a choking, cloying stench that clung to the lungs. Above the fire, the sky had turned black, dark clouds swirling, as if the heavens themselves were being consumed by the flames. The stars were gone, replaced by a sickly red glow that bathed the entire world in a cold, unnatural light. Screams filled the air, high-pitched and frantic, as people ran in all directions, desperate to escape the destruction. But their cries were swallowed by the roar of the fire, as if the earth itself had opened its mouth and devoured them. In seconds, entire neighborhoods were gone, wiped off the face of the planet. The Ylvor ships released their fury, not with mercy, but with a deliberate, cold precision. There was no hesitation in their assault. No remorse. This was not an invasion. There was no attempt to communicate, no effort to negotiate, no demand for surrender. It was a statement, a declaration made with fire. These beings, these cold, ruthless invaders from the stars, had come not to conquer or claim. They had come to annihilate. Earth, with all its life, all its stories, all its history, was nothing more than a blip in their eternal journey. A planet filled with the dreams of millions, with hopes for the future, with the laughter of children and the love of families, was nothing more than an obstacle in the way of their ambition. They didn't come seeking knowledge. They didn't come with questions or curiosity. They came with only one goal in mind: to erase. In their eyes, humanity was nothing more than an inconvenience, a fleeting flicker in the vast, cold expanse of the universe. Earth was but a footnote in their quest to wipe clean every speck of life that stood between them and their dark purpose. The fire that fell from the sky was not just a weapon. It was the end of an era. It was the beginning of something darker, something far more terrifying. And for humanity, it was only the beginning of a nightmare that no one could have ever imagined. The Ylvor Dominion were not the invaders humanity had imagined. They were nothing like the little green men or the monstrous creatures that filled the pages of ancient myths and stories of distant worlds. Their presence, though, was far more terrifying. Their skin gleamed with the unnatural smoothness of dark metal, like cold, lifeless armor. It was as if their bodies had been forged in the deepest forge of space, molded into perfection but without a trace of warmth, of humanity. Their eyes were voids, empty pools of blackness, reflecting nothing but the cold abyss of the universe. There was no soul in those eyes, no compassion, no understanding. Only a terrifying emptiness that sent shivers down the spine. These creatures were not individuals, they were a single, unified mind, bound together in a cold, calculating hive. They were driven by an insatiable hunger. Not for food or wealth, but for the very life force of intelligent species. They consumed civilizations, drained the energy of whole worlds, to fuel their own existence. They cared not for peace, nor for the lives of those they encountered. Earth, with all its life, its hopes, its dreams, was simply another prize, a snack to be devoured. The arrival of the Ylvor Dominion was swift and without warning. There was no time to prepare. No time to react. Cities that had stood for generations, symbols of human achievement and resilience, fell in an instant. The Ylvor didn't land in a gentle descent, they unleashed their wrath without hesitation. Hirama, once a city of towering buildings and bustling streets, was obliterated in the blink of an eye. A beam of light from the invaders' ships came down like a blade, slicing through the sky and striking the heart of the city. It didn't burn. It didn't smolder. It vaporized everything, turning the city into nothing but ash, a cloud of dust carried away by the wind. Veltora, another thriving city, met the same fate. Skyscrapers that had once scraped the heavens crumbled like fragile sandcastles under the weight of the Ylvor's destruction. Roads split open as though the very earth had begun to devour itself, tearing apart in jagged, desperate fractures. People ran, but there was nowhere to go. There was nothing to save. The cities, the heartbeats of humanity, were gone in seconds, leaving nothing but the remains of broken lives. Humanity stood stunned in the face of such raw, unrelenting power. There was no immediate plan. No command given. People looked to the skies, their faces frozen in disbelief, their minds struggling to grasp what was happening. How could they fight something so powerful, so overwhelming? The Ylvor had come with fire, and they believed that humanity, fragile and soft as they thought it, would fall in terror. They expected humanity to scatter into chaos, to beg for mercy. But they were wrong. As the sky above darkened to a sickening red, something deep within the hearts of humans stirred. Something primal, ancient, older than any civilization or government. It was the will to survive. The instinct to not go down without a fight, no matter the cost. In the burning wreckage of New Celestia, a woman named Thorn carried her wounded brother through a landscape of fire and destruction. The city around them was a sea of flames, licking at the darkened sky, thick black smoke choking the air. The heat was unbearable, and the world seemed to be collapsing in on itself. Yet, Kara did not falter. She had lost everything: her home, her family, her future. But she had not lost herself. She had never held a weapon before. Guns were foreign to her, something she had never imagined she would need. But with her brother's life hanging by a thread, fate had placed a rifle in her hands. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the raw, primal instinct to protect. She didn't know how to aim, didn't know how to fire. But in that moment, her hands found their grip, and her finger pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the chaos, and in that instant, the first Ylvor soldier fell. The dark, metallic form of the invader crashed to the ground, its once glowing eyes now dull and lifeless. Kara didn't stop. She couldn't. She moved forward, carrying her brother, but now armed with something far more dangerous than a weapon: determination. Across the globe, humanity began to rise. Not with organized military force. Not with coordinated strategy. No, humanity fought with something far more unpredictable. They fought with raw, unrelenting fury. Farmers picked up pitchforks, doctors wielded knives, criminals scavenged weapons. Children, too young to understand the full scope of the destruction, joined the fight. They fought with whatever they had: stones, knives, scavenged guns, and fire. The Ylvor had not prepared for this. They had believed that humanity would be fragile, that they would beg for mercy. But instead, they were met with something much more dangerous: resistance. Humanity had learned to fight, not with honor or strategy, but with a fierce, untamable will to survive. The Ylvor began to realize, slowly but surely, that they had made a grave mistake. They had thought humanity would fall in fear. But instead, humanity stood, not in terror, but in defiance. The Ylvor had thought they could crush Earth like a fleeting insect, but what they had awakened was a fire in the heart of humanity that could never be extinguished. The Ylvor had underestimated them, and now, the consequences would be far greater than they ever imagined. Civilization, once full of promise and ambition, now buckled under the weight of the Ylvor's crushing power. The cities that had once hummed with the rhythm of human life, tall towers, glowing lights, and streets packed with the buzz of industry and laughter were now nothing more than rubble. The sky, which had always been a symbol of hope and endless possibility, was now a heavy shroud of blackness. The sun was veiled behind dark clouds, thick with smoke and ash. It seemed as though the universe itself had folded in on humanity, watching as the dream that was Earth was torn apart, piece by piece. The buildings, those towering symbols of human achievement, once standing proud and unyielding, now lay like broken bones, scattered across the land. Glass shards littered the streets, glinting in the dim red light that spilled from the heavens. The foundations of these once imposing structures were cracked wide open, like wounds that could never heal. Streets, once teeming with life, were now eerily silent, save for the distant roar of fire and the faint crackle of crumbling buildings. The laughter of children had been replaced by the distant wails of those trapped, and the bustling of people going about their day was now replaced by the hollow echoes of destruction. Governments that once stood as pillars of strength and order now collapsed like fragile paper in a storm. Leaders who had once promised to protect their people were either dead or had fled, abandoning the masses to the wrath of the invaders. The systems that had once governed society turned to dust, and with it, any semblance of structure. Armies that had once marched with purpose now scattered like leaves in the wind. Soldiers, no longer bound by orders, wandered aimlessly, unsure of what to do, lost in the chaos. Once mighty forces, full of pride and strength, now lay broken, helpless, under the unyielding weight of the Ylvor's destruction. Yet, amidst the ruins, in the darkest moments when it seemed like all was lost, something ancient stirred within humanity. It was not a force of politics or order, but something deeper, something primal. The instinct to survive, to fight, even when the world around you is falling apart. The desire to hold on, to push back against the inevitable, no matter the odds. This was the true strength of humanity, the ability to rise from the ashes, to fight when it seemed there was nothing left to fight for. From the charred remains of this chaos, something unexpected began to emerge. It wasn't an army, at least not in the traditional sense. It was a resistance, a scattered group of survivors. These were the forgotten, the ones left behind in the cracks of a broken world. Criminals, outcasts, ordinary people who had nothing left to lose. Those who had been abandoned by society now found themselves at the heart of Earth's last stand. Commander Jackson Cole, a man once cast aside for his defiance against the corrupt, now found himself leading this ragtag group. He was a man who had been exiled for not bending to authority, now thrust into the position of being humanity's last hope. He had no army. He had no training. What he had was a group of desperate people, each one of them driven by the same will to survive. The group was a mixture of hardened criminals, who had been on the run all their lives, and people who had been discarded by the world, left to die in the streets. They weren't soldiers. They were survivors. And in that raw, untamed fury, they found strength. The Ylvor, sensing this growing resistance, did what they thought was necessary. They offered humanity a final choice: surrender or face extinction. They believed that humanity, facing such overwhelming power, would fall. That they would beg for mercy. But the Ylvor had no understanding of what it meant to be human. They had no comprehension of the fire that burned deep within the heart of humanity when pushed to the edge. Commander Cole stood before his broken, ragged group, the weight of their decision pressing heavily on him. His mind was full of doubt and uncertainty, but his heart was a furnace of defiance. They were outmatched, outnumbered, and without the resources to face the Ylvor. But in his eyes burned the fire of something indomitable, something that could never be extinguished. He sent a single word back to the Ylvor, a simple word that would echo across the cold vacuum of space: try. It was more than just a word. It was a declaration. A promise. They would not bend. They would not fall. The Ylvor had thought humanity would be nothing more than a fleeting spark, easily snuffed out in the face of their might. But they had underestimated the power of human will, the strength that rises when survival itself is on the line. As the Ylvor regrouped for their next wave, Earth's survivors were already preparing. They were gathering what little they had left, finding refuge in the forgotten corners of Earth, and arming themselves with whatever they could salvage. The Ylvor had made a critical mistake. They had thought humanity would break. But now, Earth's survivors weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for vengeance, for everything they had lost. The war had escalated from a fight for existence to a fight for retribution. The Ylvor Dominion, having witnessed humanity's resilience, realized that Earth's survival wasn't a mere accident. It had become an anomaly in their otherwise perfect conquests. To erase this problem, they unleashed their most devastating weapon yet. Massive warships, colossal beyond anything Earth had ever seen, descended from the sky like dark titans. Their hulking forms seemed to swallow the sky itself, their edges sharp and unyielding, gleaming cold like polished obsidian. Each ship pulsed with an energy so unnatural that it warped the very air around them, rippling the space in front of them as they moved. These were no ordinary ships. They were planetary erasers, beasts of destruction created with one purpose: to eradicate life on a scale beyond imagination. Their hulls were not just strong, they were designed to consume the very essence of planets, to hollow them out, to drain every ounce of life from them. Cities, forests, oceans, everything reduced to nothing, leaving only a barren, lifeless husk behind. This time, Earth wasn't just another conquest. No, it had become a dangerous, unpredicted anomaly that could no longer be ignored. The Ylvor were relentless, and they didn't like things they couldn't control. The sky above Earth trembled under the force of their descent. As the ships released their deadly payloads, the very air became thick with a stench of burning and destruction. The ground below seemed to shake in fear, as if it too knew what was coming. Buildings cracked, and the Earth itself seemed to bend under the weight of such destruction. But despite the overwhelming power of these invaders, something unexpected began to stir beneath their shadow. Humanity, once broken and frightened, now stood ready. They had seen their cities burn, their loved ones disappear, and yet, they did not cower. No, they fought back. It was not with armies or coordinated plans, but with something far more primal: an instinct to survive, to fight for what remained. The Ylvor might have thought they could crush Earth easily, but humanity had learned from their devastation. And this time, the survivors were ready for the worst. They wouldn't go down without a fight. Deep beneath a desolate wasteland, hidden in the cold, dark bunkers beneath Mount Viper, humanity's last hope was taking shape. The survivors, those who had been forgotten or cast aside, had found refuge in these underground sanctuaries. No longer the elite or the soldiers, these were the broken, the abandoned, the ones left behind after the initial chaos. They had no advanced weaponry, no armies at their command, only scraps, salvaged from the wreckage of the Ylvor's destructive reign. But in these scraps, humanity saw something more. They didn't just see metal and wires, they saw hope. Hope to rebuild, to resist, to strike back. Among them was Kara Thorne. She had lost everything in the initial waves: her family, her home, her future. But even in the darkness of her grief, there was fire. A fire that burned with a desire to make the invaders pay. She had crossed the desolate wasteland, her steps heavy with loss, her heart fueled by vengeance, to reach the hidden resistance. Her eyes, once filled with softness, were now hardened by the horrors she had witnessed. She didn't seek sympathy, she sought action. Her hands, once untested in battle, now gripped the rifle she had scavenged from a fallen soldier. Her fingers were no longer trembling with fear, but with a determination to make a difference. With every shot, she found her aim, each pull of the trigger more precise than the last. Kara was no longer just a survivor, she had become a weapon. She had become a force of defiance, fueled by the grief and loss she had suffered. She didn't ask for a future, she demanded it, one shot at a time. As Kara and the rest of the resistance grew stronger, something unimaginable began to take form beneath the mountain. Commander Jackson Cole, a man once disgraced and forgotten, now found himself at the heart of humanity's final stand. He was a man cast aside for his refusal to conform, yet here he was, leading humanity's last charge. His hands, scarred from years of battle, now worked tirelessly to turn alien technology into something unimaginable. His team, each person bearing their own scars and burdens, worked beside him, transforming scrap into something far more dangerous than the Ylvor had ever anticipated. They weren't just building a weapon, they were building a message, a symbol of humanity's indomitable spirit. The Ylvor had come to Earth thinking they could break its people. They had underestimated humanity's drive. And from the ashes of the chaos, Titan was born. Titan was a monstrous creation, born from nothing but desperation and the will to survive. It wasn't sleek or elegant, it was a patchwork of alien metal and human ingenuity. The hull was battered, the engines rusted, and the weapons were cobbled together from the wreckage of fallen Ylvor ships. But within its heavy frame beat the heart of a rebellion. Titan was not just a war machine, it was a symbol, a last stand for a broken world. When the engines roared to life, the ground beneath it seemed to tremble. The earth seemed to hold its breath as Titan powered up, its engines thrumming with life. It wasn't just a ship. It was the last hope of humanity, a rebellion forged in the fire of destruction. And when it surged forward into the vast expanse of space, it carried not just the weight of the resistance, but the burning will of all who had fallen. The Ylvor had unleashed their most devastating weapon, but humanity, with nothing left to lose, had crafted their own. And in that moment, Earth's defiance was not just a whisper, it was a roar that would echo through the stars. Titan was their message to the invaders: humanity was not a weak, fleeting race. They were a force to be reckoned with. Titan broke free from Earth's atmosphere with a deafening roar, its engines screaming against the void as the ship surged upward, cutting through the thick layers of smoke and ash that still clung to the planet below. The air trembled beneath the force of its ascent, and the ground seemed to quiver as though it too could feel the weight of what was happening. This was not just a ship leaving the Earth, this was humanity's defiance, thrust into the cold emptiness of space. The ship was far from elegant, it was an amalgamation of the old, the salvaged, and the broken. Nothing polished or refined like the Ylvor's cold, metallic vessels. No, Titan was the sum of desperation and fury, crafted from the wreckage of fallen Ylvor ships, from metal scavenged in haste, from wires twisted together in dark underground bunkers. It was a reflection of humanity itself, raw, imperfect, but filled with an unrelenting will to survive. Every panel on Titan's hull bore the scars of a broken world. Its engines pulsed with a guttural hum, barely holding together but powered by sheer will and determination. This wasn't just a ship, it was a statement, a final message to the Ylvor that humanity would not be erased. The journey ahead would be perilous, but there was no turning back. They had already crossed that line, and now they were on their way to confront the invaders who had thought they could crush Earth without consequence. As Titan soared into the infinite blackness of space, Earth below seemed to tremble beneath it. It wasn't just the power of the ship's engines, but the significance of what it represented. Humanity had learned the hard way that survival was never guaranteed, that life could be snuffed out in an instant. The Ylvor thought they could wipe out an entire species, believed that their superior power would shatter humanity's resolve. But they had underestimated the strength of the human spirit. Earth had survived because it was home to beings who would never bend, never break. The Ylvor might have come with fire and destruction, but humanity had risen from the ashes of that very destruction. Now, they weren't just fighting to survive, they were fighting for vengeance. In the cold emptiness of space, the crew of Titan knew their mission was one of unimaginable danger. The stars above them were distant, in different lights, watching as the last remnants of humanity made their way deeper into the Ylvor Dominion's heart. But in their hearts, too, was the fire of retribution. They were here to destroy, to make sure that the Ylvor never again had the power to erase what they had worked so hard to build. As Titan neared the heart of Ylvor territory, the unthinkable happened. A message flickered across their screens, faint and unexpected. The Ylvor, the very force that had reduced Earth to ruins, were offering a final surrender. They had miscalculated, they had underestimated humanity's resilience, and now, in the face of their own impending defeat, they sought to end the war on their terms. A final message, a final plea for peace. But Commander Jackson Cole, standing tall among the battered crew, knew the truth. This was not an offer of mercy, it was an act of desperation. The Ylvor were afraid. They had come to Earth expecting an easy victory, expecting humanity to break, to beg. But instead, they had provoked a force unlike anything they had ever encountered. The Ylvor had not conquered Earth, they had unleashed something far worse than their weapons, the human spirit. Kara, hands steady on the weapon controls, felt the weight of their mission pressing against her chest. The weight of loss, of grief, of everything that had been taken from them. There would be no mercy. There would be no negotiations. The Ylvor had come with destruction, with fire, with nothing but death. Now, it was humanity's turn to strike back. There was no turning back for her. No more running, no more hiding. This was the moment. Cole prepared for the final assault, his eyes dark with a burden of what was to come. But within those eyes burned a fire that would not be extinguished. The Ylvor had thought humanity would fall, crumble beneath the weight of their power. But they had misjudged the human will to survive. They had failed to understand that when you push humans to the edge, they fight back not out of fear, but out of a need to right the wrongs done to them. The message from the Ylvor flickered one last time, a desperate cry for surrender. But Kara's eyes, burning with the fire of all that had been lost, met Cole's. In that moment, no words were needed. They had already made their choice. They were not going to beg. They were not going to surrender. They would make the Ylvor pay for every life lost, for every city erased, for every dream shattered. As Titan locked onto its target, the crew knew they were not simply embarking on a mission of destruction. They were delivering a message that would echo across the stars, a message that would reverberate through the very fabric of space. Earth had been struck first, but now, humanity was ready to strike back. And this time, it would not be a whisper. It would be a roar that would shake the universe to its core. The vast darkness of space stretched out before them, suffocating and cold, a limitless void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. There was no light, no warmth, just an endless, oppressive emptiness. Beneath the distant shadow of Triton, one of Saturn's frozen moons, the Ylvor refueling station loomed like a silent titan in a cold expanse. It was enormous, its jagged, twisted edges reaching out into the void like the decaying remains of some ancient, forgotten god. Its surface was a harsh, steel gray, scarred from countless battles, cracked and weathered, as though it had withstood the fury of the universe itself. This place was not built for peace. It was a fortress designed for destruction, a blackened hub where the Ylvor fleet refueled before venturing out to erase entire civilizations. It hummed with an unnatural energy, a low vibration that seemed to echo through the void. To the human eyes that now watched it from Titan, it was more than a structure, it was a symbol of the Ylvor's dominance, their cold, unfeeling reign over the galaxy. And now, the crew of Titan had to infiltrate this heart of darkness. Time was running out, and there was no choice but to strike first. They couldn't afford hesitation or failure. If they didn't act, Earth would be lost forever. Kara Thorne, her eyes as cold and determined as the black abyss that surrounded them, led the charge. She could feel the weight of the mission pressing heavily on her, each step drawing them closer to an unknown fate. There was no second chance. There was no backup. It was just them and the terrifying knowledge that if they failed, humanity's last hope would be extinguished. Titan slipped through the vast emptiness of space like a predator stalking its prey. Its engines hummed, barely a whisper in the boundless void, but the tension inside the ship was palpable. As they neared the refueling station, the structure grew impossibly larger, a looming shadow that seemed to stretch across the very fabric of the universe. It dwarfed them, its towering form dominating the dark void, its scars from battle glowing faintly in the dim light of distant stars. There was no turning back now. Their mission was simple but deadly: infiltrate the Ylvor's systems, upload a virus, and cripple their fleet before they could retaliate. They had no room for error. The closer they came, the more the station seemed alive, almost sentient. It pulsed, like a heart beating with malevolent purpose, each beat sending waves of heat and static through the air. The walls hummed with an eerie resonance, and the air grew thick with an unseen tension, as though the station itself was aware of their presence. Kara could feel it in her chest, a tightness that threatened to suffocate her. The weight of what they were about to do pressed on her, but she couldn't afford to hesitate. They were close. They were almost there. Then, as they breached the station's core, the true horror of their mission was revealed. Above them, looming like an ancient nightmare, was the Dread Lord, the Ylvor's flagship. It was not just a ship. It was a living creature, a monstrosity that seemed to pulsate and writhe in the cold depths of space. Its shape was ever-shifting, as though the very fabric of reality bent around it, a godlike being forged from nightmares. Its hull, black as pitch, was alive with an otherworldly energy, glowing faintly in places where metal and flesh seemed to merge. Its eyes, cold, mechanical, watched them, calculating their every move. The Dread Lord was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the Ylvor's dominance over the universe, an indestructible titan that would never fall. Kara and her team knew that they had to destroy it, but the fear clawed at them. They were about to face the heart of the Ylvor's power, and they had no idea what would happen when they confronted it. The battle was brutal. They fought their way through the station, their bodies battered and bloodied, their resolve steeled by the sheer necessity of what they were doing. The station's corridors were tight, claustrophobic, and alive with the hum of alien technology, but the team pressed on. Kara's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her body screaming for rest, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't give in. They planted explosives at the station's neural core, the very heart of the Dreadlord's power, knowing that the virus they carried was their only hope. It was the key to destroying everything the Ylvor had built, to sending them into chaos. And then, with a final, decisive action, the virus was unleashed. What happened next was unlike anything they had imagined. The virus didn't just shut down the Ylvor's systems, it spread like wildfire, infecting every command, every soldier within the fleet. It didn't merely cause a technical malfunction. No. It was a complete collapse. The Ylvor, who had prided themselves on their unshakable order, their perfection, suddenly found their fleet in disarray. Ships stopped moving. The once pristine command stations flickered with erratic signals, lights pulsing like a heartbeat gone wild. Confusion spread through their ranks like a disease. Entire battalions of Ylvor soldiers turned inward, their once precise minds clouded by chaos. They had never encountered anything like this before. The cold, calculating force that had dominated the galaxy for eons was now gripped by uncertainty. For the first time in their existence, the Ylvor were afraid. The fear rippled through their fleet, like a virus infecting their very essence. Ships that once moved with terrifying precision now staggered, their communication lines distorted and broken. Their once perfect command structure crumbled. And all the while, Titan watched from the shadows of space, its crew aware of the momentous change that was unfolding before them. They had done it. They had broken the Ylvor. Kara, standing at the heart of it all, couldn't help but watch as the empire they had feared began to collapse. The Ylvor, who had once seen themselves as gods, were now trembling in fear, realizing that the humans they had dismissed as weak and frail were capable of far more than they had ever imagined. The Ylvor had underestimated humanity, and now, it was too late. As the chaos continued to spread through the Ylvor's ranks, Kara felt a surge of victory, but it was tempered by something deeper. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They had become something far greater. They were the storm, the reckoning. For the first time, humanity was in control. And this was just the beginning. The Ylvor had made a grave mistake, and now, they were paying the price. As the Titan drifted away from the crumbling Ylvor station, a silence fell over the ship that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of space. The vast emptiness stretched before them, cold and unyielding, as if the universe itself had become a great void, swallowing their victory. The hum of the engines was faint, barely audible against the profound stillness. It was as though Titan itself was trying to process the enormity of what had just unfolded. The ship, once a patchwork of desperation, scraps, and hope, now carried a different weight. The cold, infinite expanse of space seemed to mock their smallness, their fragility. But in that quiet, amidst the vastness and the coldness of the universe, there was something else, something profound, something terrifying. Victory, while sweet, had come at an unspeakable cost. The battle had been won, yes. But this victory had not come without sacrifices, without wounds both visible and hidden. The space around them felt heavy, as if the universe itself was waiting, watching to see what would happen next. Commander Cole stood by the observation window, his gaze fixed on the fading remains of the Ylvor station. What had once been a formidable, nearly invincible fortress now lay in ruin, its jagged metal bones scattered in the silent vacuum of space. The Ylvor fleet, once a terrifying, unstoppable force, was now in disarray, its power shattered under the weight of the virus they had unleashed. Their once perfect systems, cold, calculating, and absolute, had crumbled, sending ripples through their command, their very core. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded them for so long was now but a memory. But Cole knew better than to believe this was the end. The Ylvor were far from done. This was not their final defeat. No, this was merely the beginning of something darker, something far more dangerous. The Ylvor, in their arrogance, had made a grave mistake in underestimating humanity's resolve. But that didn't mean they wouldn't return, stronger, more ruthless, more determined. Kara stood beside Cole, her face unreadable, her eyes distant, as though the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come was too much to hold. Her hands, raw and calloused from the brutality of the battle, were clenched at her sides. She had seen her world burn and had fought to rise again from the ashes, but now, with the Ylvor's grip loosening, there was no triumph in her heart. There was only the cold realization of what lay ahead. The Ylvor were not defeated, they were merely wounded, and wounds could heal, scars could fade. Kara understood that. The Ylvor would regroup, they would adapt. And when they returned, they would be more formidable than before. They would learn from their mistakes, and humanity would be forced to face an even greater challenge. "We've sent a message," Cole muttered, his voice thick with the weight of their actions. "But it's not enough. The war's far from over." Kara's eyes flicked to him, and in that brief, silent exchange, an understanding passed between them. They didn't need words. They both knew that the Ylvor would return, and the fight would continue. Their victory was fleeting, but it was a start. A glimmer of hope. But hope alone would not be enough. Not against an enemy like the Ylvor. The crew of Titan stood silently, lost in their thoughts. The journey ahead was far from over. The Ylvor, for all their might, had learned one crucial lesson: humanity was not a weak, fragile species waiting to be consumed. Humanity had the power to fight back, to survive, and to rise up from the ashes of their destruction. The Ylvor had underestimated them, and now they would know the true cost of their arrogance. The stars above them, once distant and untouchable, now felt like a battleground. The freedom of space, once a dream of discovery and exploration, had now become something else entirely. It was no longer a hope to be chased, but a right to be fought for. Humanity's fight for survival had expanded beyond Earth. It was now a fight for their place among the stars, a fight for the future of their world, a fight to ensure that they would never again be at the mercy of the universe. As Titan sailed into the unknown, the crew could feel the shifting tides of fate around them. They had won a battle, yes. But the war was far from over. There were forces far older, far darker than the Ylvor, waiting in the shadows. The universe was vast, and not all of it was as kind as the home they had known. But for now, as they drifted farther from the ruins of the Ylvor station, they took solace in one simple truth: they were still here. They were alive. And they would not go quietly into the dark. Their fight had only just begun. As the dust settled and the fiery embers of battle slowly dimmed, Earth found itself in a state of stunned silence. The once vibrant cities, now reduced to ruins, their towering skyscrapers and bustling streets shattered, consumed by the ferocity of the Ylvor's destruction, lay in hushed devastation. The remnants of the battle seemed to blanket the earth like a dark shroud, and yet, beneath the wreckage, something stirring, something fragile began to rise. It was hope, small, delicate, like a seed breaking through the cold, hard earth after a storm. It struggled to grow, its roots fighting to dig into the soil, but it was there. Humanity was rising again, though not from untouched soil. No, it was rising from the very dust and blood of the war, from the ashes of what had been lost. It was not an easy rise. There was pain in every step, each crack in the earth a reminder of the cost. Yet, it was undeniable. Piece by piece, brick by brick, heart by heart, humanity was rebuilding itself. The world had been broken, yes, but humanity was not defeated. It was scarred, battered, but its spirit was unyielding. The resistance, once a ragtag group of scattered rebels hiding in the shadows, had evolved into something far more formidable. It had grown into a global movement, uniting people from every corner of the world, from every walk of life. No longer were they simply survivors, hiding in fear. They were fighters, determined to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The world had been ravaged, but humanity refused to be buried with it. They had faced the darkest of nights, and though they had emerged scarred, they were still standing, still fighting. The truth had become clear. Written in the very bones of the earth, it was a truth that could not be denied. Humanity would never roll over again. The Ylvor had learned that lesson the hard way. They had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest, thinking they could wipe out a species with a single sweep of their power. But what they had found instead was a people who would fight with everything they had, no matter the cost. The Dominion had miscalculated, had underestimated humanity's will to survive. And now, they were paying the price for it. But even as the echoes of the Ylvor's crumbling empire faded away, something else stirred. It was faint at first, a whisper, almost imperceptible, in the endless, cold void of space. But it was there. A presence. Ancient, malevolent, and far older than anything humanity had faced before. It had been waiting, lurking in the dark recesses of the universe. The fall of the Ylvor was no victory to it. No, it had seen what had happened, and now it stirred ready to take its place in the chaos. The war, it seemed, was far from over. Earth had fought back, yes, but the galaxy was vast, and dangers far greater than the Ylvor waited beyond the stars. As Earth's survivors rebuilt their world, they knew the fight had only just begun. They had defeated one enemy, but the universe had more in store for them. And in their hearts, a new resolve began to form. They had faced the Ylvor, but now something darker, older, and more ruthless was watching. The battle for Earth's future was far from over. Humanity, though scarred, stood on the brink of an even greater fight. They had proven their strength against one enemy, but would that be enough for the greater challenges yet to come? One thing was certain: they would not go quietly into the dark. Humanity's battle had just begun. And no matter the enemy, no matter the odds, they would fight.